golden light of evening stretched across the dusty ranch road as Samuel Hayes made his way home from another long day mending fences and tending cattle. The familiar creak of his boots against the wooden porch usually brought him comfort, but today something felt different. There in the shadows beside his weathered barn sat a figure wrapped in what looked like an old blanket. The person was small and trembling, and as Samuel approached he could hear soft whispers carried on the desert. "Wind, help me," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. Broken, Samuel stopped his weathered hands, still holding the leather reins of his horse. Molly. His 62 years had taught him to be cautious with strangers, but something in that voice reminded him of his own daughter Margaret when she was young and frightened by thunderstorms. "Miss," he called gently, stepping closer. "Are you hurt? Do you need me to call someone?" The figure looked up, and Samuel saw the face of a young woman, perhaps 30 years old. Her dark hair was matted with dust, and her eyes held a pain that went deeper than any physical wound. She clutched the blanket tighter around herself. "Please," she whispered again. "I have nowhere else to go." Samuel felt his heart stir, the way it used to when he found injured animals on his property, back when Margaret was still living at home before she moved to the city, before his wife Eleanor passed away 3 years ago. The same instinct that made him bring home stray cats and wounded birds now pulled at him. "Let me help you," he said, kneeling down to her level the way Eleanor always taught him to do when someone was hurting. "You don't have to be afraid." The young woman whose name he would later learn was Sarah had been traveling for days. She had left an abusive situation back east with nothing but the clothes on her back and what little money she could gather. The bus had broken down 50 miles from town, and she had walked until her feet were raw and bleeding. Samuel could see all of this in her eyes even before she told him. Her story unfolded slowly over the next hour, as he sat beside her on the porch steps, sharing water from his canteen, and speaking in the gentle voice he had learned from decades of calming. "Spooked horses. I worked in a diner back in Ohio," she said, finally finding her words. "My husband, he wasn't a good man, Samuel. When I finally got the courage to leave, I just started driving west. I thought maybe I could start over somewhere new." Samuel nodded, understanding more than she knew his own son Robert had left home 20 years ago, after a terrible argument. They hadn't spoken since, and Samuel carried that regret like a stone in his chest. "You know, Sarah," he said, looking out at the sunset, painting the desert mountains purple and gold, "I lost my wife 3 years ago and my children. Well, they have their own lives now. This old ranch gets mighty quiet." Sarah looked at him with something like hope flickering in her tired eyes. "What I'm saying is," Samuel continued, "I have a guest room that hasn't been used in years, and I could use some help around here if you're willing to work. You could stay as long as you need to get back on your feet." The kindness in his offer brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She had expected suspicion or demands or worse, but instead found only gentle acceptance from this weathered cowboy who asked nothing of her, but gave everything he could. The next morning, Samuel woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Something he hadn't experienced since Eleanor passed. Sarah had risen early and was cooking breakfast using ingredients from his nearly empty refrigerator. She had found one of Eleanor's old dresses in the guest room closet, and though it was a bit large, it was clean and modest. "I hope you don't mind," she said, turning from the stove. "I wanted to thank you somehow." Samuel sat at his kitchen table, the same one Eleanor had picked out 30 years ago, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The warmth of another person's presence in his home, the simple comfort of shared morning rituals. Over the following weeks, Sarah proved herself to be hardworking and gentle. She helped with the household tasks that Samuel had been neglecting and even learned to assist with the easier ranch work. Her presence brought life back to the old house. Samuel found himself remembering stories Eleanor used to tell about their early married years, when they would take in travelers who needed help. He shared these memories with Sarah over evening meals, and she listened with the patience of someone who understood loneliness. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Sarah finally told Samuel the whole story of her marriage and her escape. She spoke of fear and control, of dreams deferred, and courage finally found. Samuel listened without judgment, the way Eleanor had taught him to listen to their children when they came home with troubles. He offered no easy solutions, only presence and understanding. You know, Samuel said when she finished, I spent years thinking I failed as a father, because my son left angry, and my daughter moved so far away. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe the measure of a parent isn't in keeping your children close, but in teaching them they can always find their way home. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile Samuel had seen from her. It's like that for all of us, isn't it? She said. Sometimes we have to leave one home to find another. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah began talking about her plans. She had been saving money from helping Samuel and corresponding with her sister in California, who had offered her a place to stay and help finding work. Samuel knew she would leave eventually, and he supported her decision even as he dreaded returning to an empty house. But something unexpected happened in those final weeks. Robert called. Samuel nearly dropped the phone when he heard his son's voice after 20 years of silence. The conversation was awkward, at first filled with the careful politeness of strangers, but gradually it warmed as they spoke of Eleanor's passing, and the ranch and the ways time had changed them both. I think about coming home sometimes, Robert said finally, just to see the place again. You have a home here as long as I do, Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. When Sarah learned about the phone call, she smiled with genuine joy. Your son is ready to forgive, she said, because he knows you're the kind of man who takes in broken strangers and helps them heal. The day Sarah left for California, she stood in the same spot where Samuel had first found her, but now she was transformed. Her hair was clean and shining. She wore clothes that fit properly, and most importantly, her eyes held hope instead of fear. Thank you, she said, embracing the old cowboy who had become like a father to her. You saved my life. Samuel shook his head. No. Sarah, you saved mine. You reminded me that kindness is never wasted and that healing happens when we least expect it. 3 months later, Robert came home for a visit. He brought his wife and teenage daughter, whom Samuel had never met. The reunion was tearful and healing in ways none of them had anticipated as they sat around the same kitchen table where Samuel and Sarah had shared so many meals. Robert asked about the young woman his father had mentioned on the phone. She taught me something I had forgotten, Samuel said, looking at his granddaughter who had Eleanor's eyes. Sometimes the people who seem most broken are the ones who have the most to teach us about putting ourselves back together. Years later, when Samuel was in his 70s and Robert had moved back to help run the ranch, they would still talk about Sarah. She sent letters and pictures from California where she had built a good life for herself. She had married a kind man and opened her own small restaurant. In every letter she thanked Samuel for his kindness, but he knew the truth. The broken young woman who had appeared at his ranch that evening had given him far more than he had ever given her. She had reminded him that home isn't just a place. It's the warmth we create when we open our hearts to those who need shelter. The desert wind still blows across that ranch, and sometimes in the evening light Samuel swears he can hear Eleanor's voice carried on the breeze, reminding him that love multiplied is never diminished, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is simply to see them, not as broken but as beautifully capable of healing.